Okay. Hey, to my audience, as we begin today, let me just ask you a question. If someone found a photograph, one photograph of you 100 years from now, would they know your story? Would they know what mattered to you? Would they know what you believed? Would they know what you wanted them to remember? So today, we're going to go back more than 160 years to the battlefield at Gettysburg and the story of a fallen Civil War soldier who was found with no identification, but he was holding something. He had a photograph of his children. Heartwarming. And remarkably, that photograph eventually helped identify him and bring closure to his family. It's an incredible story. It also raises a question that I think is incredibly relevant today. We may be the most documented generation in human history, but are we actually preserving any of it? And that's what we're here to talk about today. So welcome back to another episode of Estate Planning Nightmares and How to Avoid Them. As always, I am your host, Jon Braddock, the founder of the Legacy Vault by My Life and Wishes, and author of Click Here When I Die. And today, I have the rare distinction of welcoming back a returning guest. Apparently, the first appearance didn't completely destroy his reputation, so he agreed to come back on. Now, John Benson is a partner and co-founder of the Pennsylvania estate planning firm, Penglace and Benson. And for over 20 years, he has helped hundreds of families all across Pennsylvania with estate planning and probate. And, after losing both of his parents, John saw firsthand how traditional estate planning often leaves families, unsupported. An experience that actually shaped his firm and guides his clients today through estate planning and probate needs. But he's also a Civil War historian. Now, as you may recall, John joined me back in February, and we had a fascinating conversation, but not essentially about estate planning, but about history and what previous generations can teach us about legacy. Recently, John reached out to me and he said, "Hey, I've got another story for you." And you know what? When John told me what it was, I immediately thought, boom, that is another episode. Hey, John, my friend, welcome back to the show.
John, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's always fun to talk to you. We have such engaging conversations. And again, I'm just honored that you agreed to come back.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Before we jump into this incredible story, I've got to ask, after the last episode, were you sitting around thinking, Braddock didn't get nearly enough Civil War history out of him?
Well, I wouldn't say that you didn't get enough history out of me. I wasn't sure if I had conveyed enough history to your listeners, so it was probably all on my part.
Well, as you know, as an East Coaster, as a New Jersey boy across the Delaware River from where you're at, growing up, I grew up surrounded by history, and I am a huge history fanatic. So it's always wonderful. But seriously, though, you mentioned that after the last conversation, you started thinking about, a soldier who died at Gettysburg and kind of how it tied in. And I don't want to steal any of your story here because you are the historian and I'm the guy that can barely remember where I left my car keys. So take us back to Gettysburg. Who was the soldier and what happened?
Yeah, the soldier I wanted to kind of highlight today, he was Sergeant Amos Humiston, and he was a member of the 154th New York Volunteers, which was a member of the 11th Corps, which was at Gettysburg. The 11th Corps was made up, a lot of their members were of German descent. They fought as a corps And they were located just north of the town of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. And without going, too much into the battle, because it's kind of not relevant for the discussion here, but on the afternoon of July 1st, the 11th Corps kind of broke in the face of a terrific onslaught by Confederate forces, and they started fleeing through the town of Gettysburg, and they would eventually wind up south of the town itself, up on Cemetery Hill. In that process of fleeing through the town, Sergeant Amos Humiston was shot. We don't know who shot him, but he was shot. And what we do know is after he shot, he was able to drag himself into a side alley, which was rather quiet at the time. And he was found there several days later. When they found him, he had already died, and he was found holding a daguerreotype, a picture, and it was a picture of his three children, Frank, Frederick, and Alice, as it turns out. There was no identifying names on the pictures or anything like that, really. There was nothing to identify the children as his. We could, only assume that they, at the time, that they were, his children. But he was found, with his head bowed down towards the picture, so it was clearly obvious that he died looking at this picture. Now, back in the Civil War, we didn't have the type of records we have today. We didn't even have really dog tags at the time. A soldier would often maybe pen his name into his clothing so that if he was found, people would know who he was. Maybe he would have some identifying characteristics on him. A lot of times you would die in battle next to friends and family. You fought as a town. You were recruited as all the people in a town would usually be in one unit. They would fight together. So if you died on the battle line, there was usually someone in the regiment who would know who you were and they could identify you. In this case, there wasn't. Amos did not have anything pinned to his clothing. He didn't have anything on his person when he was found that would identify who he was. And we couldn't really even identify, the children that he was looking at. And so the big question became, who is this soldier? And news of this finding went out to various newspapers. And like a story today, it traveled like wildfire and it spread across the country under either the moniker of the unknown soldier or the children of the battlefield. And there was hopes that this story would invoke something, and they would be able to show a crude picture of the daguerreotype that he had, in the hopes that someone would recognize the children, and therefore we would be able to recognize the soldier. Eventually, in October of 1863, and the battle itself was in July of 1863,
Wow.
his wife, Philinda Humiston, saw the picture of the children. She lived in Portville, New York. And we know that, obviously Amos is from the 154th New York Volunteers. And she was able to identify the children as hers, and word got out, and we were able to, eventually, mark Amos Humiston's grave. He's buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery to this day. The story itself was very popular at the time, and just the reaction to the whole story uh, resulted in funds coming on in, and they were actually able to fund the National Soldiers Orphan Homestead in Gettysburg, of which Philinda would serve on the board there. Um, and so just having this picture, just having this story told us something about the soldier, who he was, where he came from, so that he could be properly documented and given the credit that he so richly deserved as defending the nation. And it really struck me for a number of reasons. But for this picture, he would have been lost to history. He would have just been another unknown soldier. And there's quite a few unknown soldier graves at Gettysburg. No one was around to identify the body. There was nothing on the body to identify them, and to this day, they are unknown soldiers. And their families would go on through history and not know what happened to their relative. They might have gotten word that their relative, was on the way to a particular battle, but then when they didn't hear from him again, they were left to wonder what happened to them. Were they wounded? Were they killed? Were they wounded and died subsequently after? Their story would have been lost, but in this case, for a picture. And pictures are very important. And it told a greater story that people don't, I think, understand is that we now know that in his last moments alive, what he did was he was spending them looking at his children. And imagine what that meant to the family. That this is how he died. This is what was important to him.
Oh
And
yeah,
so
the
yeah, I think
kids.
it bears telling that, estate planning is, we tend to think of estate planning as a will, a living will, a power of attorney, and who's going to get my stuff. But
Yeah.
estate planning is also who you are and the pictures that were important to you and what they tell.
Oh, exactly. To kind of amplify. So here's this soldier. He's getting no identification because we didn't have the dog tags and things, and you know, mom or wife hadn't sewn a name tag in the clothing. His family has no idea, but he's carrying this photograph, and for his children to have known, that when dad died, what really meant the most, he was looking at that picture, and from that and the circulation, the publicity, eventually his wife sees the photograph, recognizes the kids, which means she finally knows what happened to her husband, unlike so many others. And the reason I think it's so powerful, like you said, John, because that photograph wasn't just a photograph anymore. It became his identity. It connected a nameless soldier on a battlefield back to his wife and the children that loved him. So, it gets me thinking, you mentioned about wills and trusts. I mean, today we think about wills, trusts,
Mhm.
POAs, beneficiary designations, all these formal estate planning documents that we all have. But for an ordinary Civil War soldier heading into battle, what did estate planning look like? Did these guys even like have wills back then? Or was it more along the lines of, Bill gets my horse and Sam gets my rifle, and somebody please tell my half brother that he still owes me $1.50? What did people actually do back then, John?
Well, I mean, we had wills back then, but those were, you went and you drafted something formal when you had the money to go and do that. And so while we had wills back then, the vast majority of people couldn't afford the will. They didn't have access to a way to do it properly. And so a lot of times they would do is they would just jot something down. And everyone would say, okay, well, you wrote it down. That's what we're supposed to do. Um, Amos didn't leave behind that we know of. He didn't leave behind a will or anything. The only thing that he left behind was a picture, and that was basically his estate plan that told what was important to him. Remember, it's called a last will and testament, and that's the testamentary part where he conveyed through this picture what was most important to him. And so, yeah, a lot of situations, the soldiers would just jot something down, if that, and then we would go with it. Let me look back. Let me tell, if I can, let me tell another story.
Please.
Uh, Now this goes to July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg, and again, it's an afternoon going into the evening type thing. And on the afternoon of July 2nd, the Confederates surrounded pretty much the town of Gettysburg on at least the northern and western side. And one of the units was Major General Jubal Early's Confederate brigade. They were in the town of Gettysburg itself, and Jubal Early had ordered an attack on Cemetery Hill, where ironically Amos Humiston probably would have wound up had he survived. It was a twilight attack, And the Confederates were going to have to move across a wide open field in front of a terrific amount of artillery and infantry fire. One of the brigades that was going to be involved here was Hoke's Brigade and was commanded by Colonel Isaac Avery. He commanded the 6th, the 21st, and the 57th North Carolina. And Isaac Avery was up on a big white horse. He was a very conspicuous target on the evening of July 2nd, moving across because A, he's on a white horse, B, he's one of the few that are on a horse, so he's sitting up high. As he is leading the attack, he is shot in the neck. He falls from his horse, and his friend Major Samuel McDowell Tate came to his side. Now, Isaac Avery, due to his neck injury, he could not speak at that point, and he was partially paralyzed. But he did have use, or at least limited use, of his left hand. And in his last moments, knowing that he was about to die, he scrawled a note out, and it was given to Major Samuel Tate. And the note reads, "Major, tell my father that I died with my face to the enemy." That was his last words. And again, that goes to his testament. That was at that moment the one thing that he could give, and it wasn't physical. The one thing that he could give was his father the assurance that he had done his duty, that he had done everything possible to do that duty. Back in the day, a Southerner, the most important thing to them was honor. And so he wanted his father to know that he had done his duty and he had died with honor. And that was all that he had to give. And again, I think it's so important, to note that, expressing these feelings, expressing, what you're all about. Those are things that sometimes gets lost in estate planning nowadays. While things are, we talked before, while things are so much more technologically advanced now, we're actually, in my opinion, doing a worse job today documenting what we do and how we do it than we did back in the 1860s.
Yeah, that just really resonates. Again, we think about estate planning, and so the documents says, what we have and who should have it. None of those documents tell my family who I am, what kind of man I am, what kind of person. And what's so powerful about that is, being able to, scratch something out and just tell my father that I died facing the enemy. That's character. There's no legal document that says what my character was, who I was, the kind of human being that I was. Yeah, that's just, these letters, for some families, it's the last words that they'll ever have from that person, that something they think is lost. But in this case, it's like, boom, they have this, they know the person, the character, my dearest Michelle, we'd write this stuff out. And it's like, today we're just on our phone with a text message. Our response might be, "Okay, we've lost something, John."
Yeah, I mean, here's a good example of, we won't get into, the cause or anything like that, or the political standpoint of the two sides. But here's an example of, 166 years later, we still know to this day what this individual was about and what was important to him. And that is something that you sometimes will lose in estate planning. We get so wrapped up in making sure that the bank account's transferred, that the car goes to the right person, your friend gets the TV, that we lose track of estate planning is about passing on your history. So using this as an example, when my mother died, she had chronic asthma. And so when COVID came, she figured that that was the end. There was just no way she was ever going to survive anything that was going to come at her in COVID. And so she wrote a letter to me, hand wrote a letter, put it in an envelope, and then put that envelope in a box where the will was eventually found. Um, when she died, I went through that box 2 days after she died, about 2 days before the funeral, and I found the letter for the first time. I still have the letter to this day. And, she just in a few, in a few sheets of paper, she told me what she wanted me to know. And, at the point in time when you need to hear from your deceased, loved one so bad, to be able to have that letter and to hear from them, um, is, you can't put a price on it. So, through your digital vault, you can record a video. You can upload this letter. Wouldn't you like your children to hear from you on their wedding day if you're not going to be around? Wouldn't you like your grandchildren to hear from you on their graduation day if you're not going to be around? And these are things that as estate planners, we need to kind of have these conversations with the clients. So we say, look, it's okay. We're going to protect the physical things, but it's the things that, that are intangible that we also have to protect. Just like the pictures, you and I were talking beforehand, you know, Amos Humiston, he had a picture. Now, wouldn't that picture have been better if it had given us some more specifics written on the back? So when my mom died, I've got all these, physical pictures. I don't know who the people are in them because, she took them, she saved them, but she didn't document them. And now we're in the digital age. So how many pictures do we take a day on these phones? And we don't really document who's in the picture. And number one, if they die, if you don't give them the password to get into the phone, they're not going to be able to download the picture. And even if they download the picture, they're not going to know who's in the picture, which means a part of your history is while you recorded it, it's really lost.
Absolutely. And this is why I think his story becomes so relevant now in 2026. 166 years ago, Amos Humiston had one photograph, one physical photograph that survived, and we're still talking about it. Meanwhile, like you just said, you and I were talking earlier about this. I open my phone. I have over 30,000 photographs in my iCloud. Half of them are screenshots. I have absolutely no recognition of taking them or even why I took them, right? And that's the paradox, because we try to document practically everything today, right? I mean, photos, videos, text messages, emails, Facebook posts, Instagram, voice messages, cloud storage. We have more recorded information about our lives than any generation before us. But how much of it will actually survive? Because we're not accurately documenting it. So as someone who loves and studies history, does that concern you, John, that like are historians 100 years from now potentially going to know less about ordinary people today because so much of our communication is digital and disposable?
I think they're going to know the big picture. They're going to lose the small picture. So, they're going to be able to go back, and there's plenty of documents that can be found that are going to document, the conflict that is going on in Iran right now, or the Gulf War. We'll just use, wars that were not too long ago, or the war on terror that's going on. They'll be able to tell the big pictures because they're preserved in newsreels and everything. And they were obviously preserved, for the Civil War. what you lose is the individual's perspective, and you lose the individual in it. So, a lot of these soldiers, they would write, diaries and journals and letters, and those were preserved by their families over the years. And they were writing in what historian James McPherson quoted as, they were writing in the immediacy of the moment. When something was happening, they weren't waiting a couple of days after a battle. They would write, when they had some, time to rest, just before they're going into a battle, or they would write when something would happen in the battle, or they would write right after the battle, and then we could see exactly what they were going through, what they were thinking, what was important to them. And we lose that in a text. We're so used to just sending text, and for the listeners, how many times have you sent a text, you've deleted the thread, and then you suddenly went, "Oh, I wish I hadn't done that," and it's gone. We're so used to sending something in an email that we don't actually put pen to paper, so we have nothing to really hold later on that is going to tell what we were thinking, what we were experiencing. So let me share with you one final story.
Absolutely.
And this one now goes to July 3rd at Gettysburg. And if anyone who has studied the Battle of Gettysburg or heard of the Battle of Gettysburg has probably heard of Pickett's Charge.
Mhm.
It was the largest charge in U.S. military history at the time. It involved, a charge of, over 11,000 Confederate soldiers against the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Right before Pickett's charge, it was preceded by a massive cannonade. The Confederates had well over 150 guns, 150 cannon that they opened up on one position on Cemetery Ridge, and was responded to by the Union by 106 cannon. And these were exchanging shot for shot for quite some time. One of the men just lying among the ranks was Private Jeremiah Gage of the 11th Mississippi. And while he was lying there in the ranks trying to protect himself, a shell struck right next to him. It ripped his upper left arm and tore open his abdomen.
Mhm.
And he was told right after the wounding that he was going to die. It was a mortal wound. There was nothing anyone at the time could do for him. Knowing that, he requested a pencil and a piece of paper, and he wanted to write his mother. He wrote her this note: "This is the last you may ever hear from me. I have time to tell you that I died like a man. Bear my loss the best you can. Remember that I am true to my country, and my greatest regret at dying is that she is not free, and that you and my sisters are robbed of my worth, whatever that may be. I hope this will reach you, and you must not regret that my body can't be obtained. It is a mere matter of form anyhow. This is for my sisters too, as I cannot write more. Send my dying release to Miss Mary, you know who." That was the last he wrote, and he died 4 hours after writing that note. And again, here's something that we can see what he was going through and what was in his last thoughts. And that tells us something about who he was and what was important to him. And we lose that in an email and a text because it will be deleted, it will not be saved. And so, part of my, estate plan, and the part of the plan that I try and emphasize to my clients is that, I have my mother's journals. Um, they're preserved in a box. I found them. It would have been better if she had kept them all together with her estate plan, but they're all now together. And I can go back and I can see, what she was doing on a particular day, what she was thinking, what she was feeling. And that tells me something about her. And those stories I am now able to pass down to my children, and hopefully they will pass it down to theirs. And so, this is just, again, another example of how, detailed we were back then and how much we were able to actually record that we have 160 years later. I don't know who this soldier was, but I do know what was important to him. And if he had nothing else to pass down, he has passed down what was important to him to me, a person who is not related to the family, who never met a member of the family. But now I know what he is about. So you have to ask yourself, do you want people in 160 years to know what you were about? Do you want your great grandchildren to know what you stood for and what you believed? If you do, then you need to go and you need to preserve those things. And the digital vault is a great way to do that because it makes it so easy to just upload these things. And now we have them so that if your written word disappears, at least we do have an electronic copy. So, as part of estate planning, you should be, saving these things. You should be recording on the backs of pictures. Who's in the picture? Because my parents were always like, "Oh, we have to sit down with you, and we're going to tell you, who's in the picture." Yeah, 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 Dad. And, we'll get to it tomorrow. And now I'm robbed of those things, but I'm going to certainly make sure that my kids they don't have the same problem, and I'm going to do estate planning so that my thoughts and my words and what were important to me will be known by subsequent generations.
Yeah, there's such a huge lesson here. I don't know if you've seen or not. I have a newsletter on LinkedIn. It's called Beyond the Documents.
Mhm.
It's all about providing clarity to family and deeper legacy, because what we've talked about in these three stories, it it's not about stuff. It's about who these people were, what they felt in their heart and in their head. And in my opinion, that's really legacy. The will can tell my family what I own, and the trust can tell them where things should go, and financial documents can tell them what things are worth, right? But not one of these things tells my grandchildren who I was. And I think these stories and the lessons of Gettysburg, are so important because we spend so much time preserving assets. Maybe we should spend a little more time preserving ourselves.
I think you're right. Like I said, that as I'm going through all these stories, reading in books and my various studies and everything like that, I'm constantly seeing, information about, who these folks were and, what they believed in and, what was important to them. And I'm struck that, the common soldier in the Civil War, they usually didn't have a whole lot. The typical Southern soldier would never be involved in slavery in any form. They were fighting for a way of life, some of which a life that they didn't know. And for the Northern soldier, same thing. They didn't have a lot, but what they did have was their thoughts and what was important to them. And here are three examples that in dying moments, these soldiers, both North and South, the only thing they really had to give was what was important to them at the very end. And they wanted their families to have comfort. That was something that my mom wanted me to have. She wanted me to have, comfort, even though she knew I was going to be distraught. And so, as you do your estate planning, you want to make sure that both you and your clients are conveying to the people that will be left behind the things that were important to you, the things that you stood for, so that they can be remembered and they can be honored. And that, at the end of the day, is estate planning. It is a will and testament.
Uh, you know, so true. I think far too often people think about estate planning as one question: what do I want my family to have?
Mhm.
The missing question, which I know you, John, and for your clients, this question is not missing, but I think it's lost on far too many out there. So, beyond what do you want your family to have, what do you want your family to know? Estate planning tends to do a pretty good job on that first question. What do you want them to have? but I'm not convinced at all we do nearly enough on that second one. What do we want the family to know? So, it just, I got 1,001, questions. We have the opportunity today that Amos didn't, that Isaac didn't, that Jeremiah Gage did not have. They had a photograph or they jotted a note. We can leave our voice. We can leave videos. We can leave our stories. We can explain why we made certain decisions that we did. We can tell our children what we're proud of and how proud we are of them. And I can tell my grandchildren stories that they may be too young to understand today. We can leave messages for people to watch someday when they're not sitting beside them anymore. And that's incredibly powerful. We always talk about, and I love the fact, you have your mom's journal and you pass that down. And some people save recipes and those kind of things. And we talk about writing legacy letters, which are great. The only thing I think is even better than leaving a legacy letter for family is record it. Because now, 100 years from now, a great or great grandchild of mine can actually hear who I was, what I believed, what I thought. They can see what I looked like, and they can hear my voice.
No, you're absolutely right, and that is estate planning. It's what are you going to pass down, and even if you don't have anything, conveying what was important to you, that's your testament, and that is important. So there isn't a single person that estate planning cannot be for. You don't have to wait until you have something to hand it down. You do have something. You have you. You have a last message that you want to convey to your loved ones. And do not make the mistake that we're making today. Go back 160 years. I heard an elderly attorney that I met one day. He was in his 90s, many years ago, and he said to me, he says, "Do you know what the definition of progress is?" And I kind of looked and I knew that I knew there was going to be some funny, story at the end of it. I said, so I played. I'm like, no, what is the definition of progress? And he said, it is the constant effort to get back to the way things used to be. And so, in this case, you want to go and you want to hand record things because we're getting a little lazy now with technology. We're letting AI do our jobs for us. We're letting AI think for us. We're letting text messages and emails get past the written word, and that's fine in some context. But ask yourself, are you going to be able to pass these things down? The pictures that you took on that vacation with your kids and everything. How is that going to get off of your phone and to them? And how is it going to be documented so that people will know what it is? My wife does a really good job that, every year at the end of the year, she will download all the pictures that she took and she'll put them in an album and she'll label that album for that particular year. But still, if you don't have the passcode to get into the computer to get those things, you're not going to get them. So people just need to spend some time thinking about how is this going to get to people years from now? And if you don't have a plan, then the answer is it won't.
Absolutely. Again, an estate is what we leave. A legacy is what continues because we're here. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. I mean, you can leave somebody money without leaving them wisdom. We can leave them property without leaving the story behind it. And we can leave them possessions without ever explaining why those possessions mattered. I think the big lesson is, don't just preserve things, preserve your story. the story behind them, because 50 years from now or 100 years from now, nobody may know why that old pocket watch mattered so much unless there's a story behind it. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So let's make it practical. Someone's listening right now thinking, okay, John and John, uh, you've successfully made me contemplate my own mortality during my morning walk while I've been listening. Thank you very much. What should they do? If somebody wanted to begin preserving their family history today, what's one thing you'd tell them? Start here.
The one thing you do is you start documenting better. So now there's not one in today's age, there's not just one thing you can do other than get started. Hope is not a plan. So doing things like, hey, actually write that letter to your kids to be read one day. Record it in the legacy vault so it is electronic as well as written. Put that document with your will so it can be found. We tell people, hey, take your will, take your life insurance policy, a copy of your bank statement so we know what bank you were using, an inventory of your assets, a list of your passwords, and now this letter. Put it all together in physically one spot and tell people where it is so that they don't have to play hide and go seek when it comes time. Now, you would also take those things and you would upload them into the digital vault. And now we've got them in two places. So now we know that, if I'm traveling, I'm not going to lose anything. I have it. My backup executors, they have it. But in Pennsylvania, we're not at the point where we can accept electronic wills. So we want to also store, a physical copy. But if you have pictures, if they're physical pictures, make sure that you've documented on the back of them what they are. If they're electronic pictures, then have in that digital vault information on where we can find those pictures. If you have a way to edit your pictures, find a way to start putting information on that as to who's in the picture, where the picture was taken, when the picture was taken. Start, laying the groundwork of where things were and documenting the best of them the way you can now, and don't be lazy about it and just send a text, send an email, and that'll be the end of it. So the number one thing to do is get started.
No, absolutely. I love that. That's the thing, like you say, hope is not a plan. Someday is not a plan. Today is. And, I add one other thing that's incredibly simple and it's easy. Record one story. To our listener, record one story. Don't try and document your entire life this weekend, because you'll make it to approximately, 1987 and then you'll quit, right? Just pick one story. Tell your kids how you met their mother. Tell them about your first job. Tell them about your grandparents. I mean, my kids don't even know my grandparents. They weren't around the time they came along. Tell them a story about your grandparents. Explain the story behind a family heirloom. That rocking chair that sits in the corner that no one's allowed to touch or sit in. Talk about a mistake that you maybe made at one time. Record something you want someone to love. Just one.
Yeah, and it only takes one.
Yeah. Then do another one some other day. Legacy doesn't have to be created in one afternoon. We can build it one story at a time. But if we don't start, it'll never get done.
Yeah, I mean, it just starts with the story, and don't be too concerned with the story itself. Look at these three soldiers. Not one of these do they go and to explain to their family, this is why I decided to fight in the Civil War, because that wasn't important. That wasn't important to them. The only thing that was important is they wanted their loved ones to know that they were being thought of in the last moments, and that they stood for a particular ideal, duty, honor. They wanted to convey that simple message. And so if you just take the time to express some way that it can be recorded, what you thought of, your family, that, what you wanted them to know, then in 160 years, we will still know what you were about. And could there be a better way to celebrate the lives of these three individuals than to continue knowing and honoring what they were about, and that was family?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, again, your legacy isn't simply what you leave behind, it's what you intentionally preserve. So, hey, John, this has been so great. Love having you. And you're going to come back because I know you've got stories that are so relevant to what we all think about today and how we should be planning our future. So I'm honored that
Thank
you've.
you for having me. I'm always going to come back.
Oh, that's great. Our first conversation was terrific, but I think this one takes the idea of legacy somewhere completely different. And to everyone listening, I've included John's contact information below in the show notes, so feel free to reach out to him should you need any assistance, have any questions. But finally, to our audience, here's my challenge for you. Sometime this week, take out your phone, not to check Facebook, not to answer a call, and for heaven's sakes, not to watch another video of somebody's dog riding on a Roomba. Okay.
Well, those are good.
They are fun. But this week, take it out, not to do those things. Hit record. Tell one story. 5 minutes. That's it. Tell a story that someone you love might treasure someday. Because your family can inherit your house, they can inherit your money, they can inherit your stuff, but they can't inherit a story that you never told them. And I'm Jon Braddock. This has been Estate Planning Nightmares and How to Avoid Them. Remember, confusion creates conflict. Clarity creates peace. Documents settle an estate, but stories will preserve the person. So plan ahead and make it a great day.